Former U.S. President Jimmy Carter has been honored with a state funeral in Washington, D.C. The 39th U.S. president died last month, aged 100. The ceremony achieved something rare in U.S. politics today. It put partisan divisions aside, albeit just for a few hours.
Yet shall I see God, whom I shall see for myself, and no man dieth to himself.
America says goodbye to its longest-living leader. A final farewell to Jimmy Carter, the peanut farmer who became president, with a kind of pomp and ceremony that he rejected. It brought together all 5 living presidents: Joe Biden, Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, Barack Obama and Donald Trump, an occasion that bridged political divides. Building bridges was a theme of Carter's life. He defeated President Gerald Ford in the 1976 election. Afterwards, they became close friends and agreed to write a eulogy for each of his funerals. Steve Ford, the son of former President Ford, read his father's tribute to Jimmy Carter.
Now, this is not to say that Jimmy never got under my skin. But has there ever been a group of politicians that didn't do that to one another? During our 1976 contest, Jimmy knew my political vulnerabilities, and he successfully pointed them out. Now, I didn't like it, but little could I know that the outcome of that 1976 election would bring about one of my deepest and most enduring friendships.
President Biden was the first senator to endorse Carter's bid for the White House. In his eulogy, he praised the character of his friend.
Jimmy Carter's friendship taught me, and through his life taught me, the strength of character is more than title or the power we hold. It's the strength to understand that everyone should be treated with dignity, respect, that everyone, and I mean everyone, deserves an even shot.
In Washington's National Cathedral, America was united in tribute to Jimmy Carter. After the service, the former president was taken to Plains, Georgia, to be buried on the grounds of his home.
I'm joined in the studio by Stephen Beardsley just to talk about the former president a little bit more. He was extremely well known, wasn't he, Stephen, for his humanitarian work after leaving the White House. So tell us how this has affected his legacy. How is he being talked about?
Anya, that is Jimmy Carter's legacy, to be honest. I think that's what most people really know him for and remember him for. Even those who were born after his presidency, they may have come into contact with his efforts later. Everything that he's done charitably, everything that he's done in a service sense, even those who went down to Plains, Georgia and sat in on a Sunday school session that he taught and was still teaching until just years before his death. That's all quite remarkable. Janelle alluded to this. Jimmy Carter was not comfortable in Washington, D.C. He was a one-term president, perhaps because of that, perhaps because of other challenges. But he used that time at the highest level and then leveraged it to do something quite remarkable in an area where he was comfortable, and that is service, serving others, his religiosity. He's very much a believer, a Christian believer, very much wanted to take those kinds of beliefs and make them concrete. And so she mentioned Habitat for Humanity. That's what many Americans know Jimmy Carter for, and that is a charitable organization that he was very closely aligned with, in which it builds homes for those who cannot afford to build their own homes. And they basically put in sweat equity. Janelle mentioned the sweat that you would see on these people's faces. Jimmy Carter's face, he would often take a hammer and nail and get in there as well. I worked on them as a kid as well. Everyone knew these projects. Another thing, the Carter Center in Atlanta that he founded to do charitable works around the world. One thing that they focused on was eliminating this tiny malady in Africa, which was actually not tiny at all for many Africans, called the guinea worm. Now, most of us don't know anything about it if you're in Western countries, if you're in the US or Europe, but it's a terrible affliction. a parasitic worm that would enter someone's water someone's body, through contaminated water. Jimmy Carter was exposed to this on a trip to Africa, and when World Health officials said we need to eradicate this, he said, I'm going to be the one to do it. And today, the cases of guinea worm have fallen dramatically from millions to just a handful. And Jimmy Carter owns that legacy. And many people know that, not just in the US, but as Janelle said, elsewhere. So he will be remembered more than likely for his post-presidency than his actual presidency.
So he really had a concrete effect on people's
lives.
He made people's lives better.
I mean, we're talking about hammers and nails. He was out there hammering and nailing. We're talking about diseases. So it wasn't a foundation. It wasn't something where he went around giving speeches for money. His post-presidency has not been emulated since. And I think many people look at it against the foil of modern post-presidencies, where people do give speeches for a lot of money. They create foundations with questionable donations, and there's sort of the political line that gets played in there. Jimmy Carter didn't want any of that. That wasn't really his style in the first place. But he could leverage his time as a president for something good, and that's what he did.
If we could just go back to his time as a president, he was a one-term president. He did have very challenging times, difficult situations during his presidency. Just tell us a little bit more about those.
Yeah, two words: inflation and unemployment. That's really what hit Jimmy Carter during his time in the Oval Office. And there was an oil embargo. There were two oil embargoes. I should say there were two oil crises. There was an oil embargo that hit just before his presidency. Inflation was already quite high. Americans had been paying more at the gas pump. That's not good, right? American politics are really based on having cheap gasoline in many ways. He came in there, and this trends continued, and unemployment grew and grew. So he had the double challenge of higher prices, but also rising unemployment. And it was a time in which U.S. policy really had to shift gears and assess how it was going to deal with this. The way that it managed monetary policy, economic policy, was completely different before and after Jimmy Carter's presidency. And he lived out probably the most difficult period of that. On top of that were major shifts in the Middle East that often spurred some of these problems, including the revolution in Iran, but also Soviet incursions into Afghanistan, the Soviet role in the Middle East, the conflict between Israel and Arab nations. All of this really sort of coming together during his time in office. And really, it reached a crescendo when, in 1979, he gave a speech that is very famous today. It's called the Malaise speech, even though he didn't use that word. But he basically diagnosed America as having a crisis of confidence. And he said, we've become too materialistic. We've become too focused on consumption. We're losing our way. We need to remember our optimism and look ahead and know that times are getting better. And he said, we're going to become energy independent. And when you read that speech today, a lot of it is very forward-looking. A lot of it, what he said, you could say, is still true today. The energy independence point definitely sticks still today. But he was lampooned for that. And it was very much a sticking point from his opponents who said, we're going to be optimistic that things are going to get better. It's not the Americans that are at fault here. It's just everything else that is. And that's a simplistic way of looking at it. But basically, instead of diagnosing Americans and saying, you're the problem, you need to sort of reform yourselves, which is also a very religious message that Americans are actually accustomed to hearing. But they didn't want to hear it from Jimmy Carter. And Ronald Reagan said, ultimately, the question that he posed in one of their most famous debates was, are you better off today than you were 4 years ago when Jimmy Carter came to office? And most Americans could not say that they were. And that probably cost him his presidency more than anything else.
All right, a one-term president, but as you were saying, Stephen, an incredible legacy, very much created by the humanitarian work that he did after leaving office. DW Stephen Beardsley, thank you so much.
I want to cross over now to our correspondent, Janelle Dumoulin. She is at the Washington National Cathedral, the scene of a country bidding farewell to one of its presidents. Janelle, just tell us, what are you seeing and hearing?
Indeed, this is a very, very cold day where America is saying goodbye to former President Jimmy Carter, who of course lived to be 100 years old and did so much within that lifetime. Now, of course, the mood here is sufficiently somber. Now, inside, it's been a mix of tributes to the former president, a mix of song by the likes of military choirs, a military band, the Cathedral Chorus, as well as tributes from the sons of former President Gerald Ford and former Vice President Walter Mondale. President Joe Biden also giving a eulogy here today. It is widely known that the two men had become great friends over Jimmy Carter's lifetime. Now, this is an event that marks just the tail end of about a week of memorial services for President Jimmy Carter. He had been lying in state at the Capitol for the past days, where thousands of Americans really lined up in very cold conditions, in snow, in wind, and in ice, in order to be able to pay the respects to this man. You know, he had a very long post-presidential life. He may have had a single term, but after that followed some 44 years of public service, and not just here in America, but abroad. And everyone you ask, and really universally anyone I have talked to, had said that they are saying farewell to a man that they remember as good, decent, and dedicated to serving his fellow human being.
And we know that the five former and current presidents, I'm thinking of Clinton, Bush, Obama, Trump, and Biden, they're all there in that building. What does it say about Carter that his ability to reach people across the political aisle?
Indeed, this could be considered a moment of unity. These are five different presidents, five very different men who have all gathered here as very much the norms dictate. But of course, America is also at this very specific political moment. It is saying goodbye to Jimmy Carter and the certain era he represented of values-driven politics, while about to say hello again to incoming President Donald Trump, who's set to be inaugurated in about 11 days from now, who, of course, embodies a different set of values than Jimmy Carter. Now, the past presidents have apart from Donald Trump, have been pretty much unified in their praise and admiration. Donald Trump striking a more critical note, but none of that is expected to be heard from him, at least on this day.
Okay, our correspondent Janelle Dumaloun there in Washington, D.C. at the state funeral for Jimmy Carter. Janelle, thank you.